again." Words echoed through the marble foyer just minutes before the church service began. Everyone heard them. The elderly millionaire didn't even look at the woman holding the mop. "You missed a spot." She quietly returned and cleaned the exact same tile for the third time. Some members laughed, others looked away. Every single Sunday. It was the same humiliation. No one knew why she never answered back. No one knew why she always smiled. And absolutely no one expected that 4 weeks later, the same old man would die and leave behind a will that would expose something far more valuable than money. Not a hidden fortune, not a secret company, but one decision made 38 years earlier that every person inside that church had unknowingly benefited from. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. If stories that reveal hidden truths inspire you, subscribe and join our community. Clean it again. Words echoed across the polished marble foyer just minutes before the first church service of the morning. Conversation stopped. The choir members arranging their robes looked toward the entrance. Ushers froze with offering baskets in their hands. Families walking through the grand wooden doors slowed their steps, pretending not to stare while secretly watching every second unfold. Standing beneath the towering stained glass windows was Harold Bennett, one of the wealthiest men in Georgia and the longest-serving elder in New Hope Community Church. At 78, Harold carried himself with the confidence of a man who had spent his entire life being obeyed. His tailored charcoal suit fit perfectly despite his age. His polished shoes reflected the morning light streaming through the church entrance, and his silver walking cane rested firmly against the marble floor, not because he needed help standing, but because it completed the image he carefully crafted every Sunday. His eyes never met the woman kneeling on the floor. Instead, he pointed toward a faint streak barely visible beside one of the marble tiles. "You missed that." Woman quietly looked where he pointed. Without saying a word, she dipped her cleaning cloth into a bucket of warm water and scrubbed the exact same spot she had already cleaned twice that morning. Her name was Grace Holloway. She was 68 years old. For nearly 4 decades, she had arrived at the church before sunrise every Sunday, long before the choir rehearsed, long before the pastors unlocked their offices, long before the parking lot filled with luxury cars and smiling families dressed in their finest clothes. She swept every hallway, she polished every pew, she dusted every window, she arranged every hymn book, she cleaned every restroom. When the church lights came on each Sunday morning, everything sparkled because Grace had already been working for hours. Most people never noticed. Those who did usually greeted her with a smile. Everyone except Harold Bennett. He stepped closer and looked down at the floor again. "It still doesn't shine." Grace quietly reached for a dry cloth and polished the tile a third time. "Better." His voice carried through the foyer. "But not good enough." A few young adults standing nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. One teenage boy looked as though he wanted to say something before his mother gently pulled him away. An elderly couple whispered to each other. Across the room, 2 businessmen chuckled quietly before walking toward the sanctuary. No one interrupted. No one defended her. No one asked Harold to stop. It had become routine. Every Sunday brought another criticism. Sometimes it was a window, sometimes a staircase, sometimes the brass handrails, sometimes dust that no one else could even see. Harold always found something. Grace always apologized. Then she continued working. It had happened so many times that most church members had stopped noticing. But not everyone. Standing beside the information desk was 29-year-old Associate Pastor Daniel Brooks. Unlike many of the senior leaders, Daniel hadn't grown up at New Hope Community Church. He had only joined the ministry 18 months earlier after serving in a small congregation outside Birmingham. He watched the exchange unfold with growing discomfort. This wasn't the first time, nor the second. Every Sunday seemed to begin exactly the same way. Grace working, Harold criticizing, everyone pretending it wasn't happening. Daniel finally walked over. "Good morning, Elder Bennett." Harold barely acknowledged him. "Morning." Daniel forced a polite smile before turning toward Grace. "Everything all right, Miss Grace?" She smiled warmly, though her knees were still pressed against the cold marble floor. "I'm perfectly fine, Pastor," Harold answered before she could continue. "She's learning." Daniel looked from Harold to Grace. Learning. The woman had worked in this building longer than he had been alive. Yet she simply nodded. "I'll finish this section before service starts." Harold adjusted the cuff of his expensive suit jacket. "I certainly hope so." Without another word, he walked away toward the sanctuary entrance where several church leaders immediately greeted him with admiration and handshakes. Daniel remained standing. "Miss Grace," she continued, polishing the marble, "you don't have to keep doing this." She smiled again. "Oh, sweetheart." Her voice was gentle enough to calm a storm. "Some battles aren't won by arguing." Daniel frowned. "But he humiliates you." Grace wrung out the cloth before placing it back inside the bucket. "If I let another person's words decide my peace, then I've handed them something that belongs to God." Daniel didn't know how to answer. She wasn't bitter. She wasn't angry. She wasn't embarrassed. She simply returned to work, as if the conversation had never happened. For the rest of the morning, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about what he had witnessed. After the first service ended, members flooded the lobby. Children laughed while chasing one another around the welcome center. Families stopped for coffee. Business owners exchanged cards. Visitors complimented the choir. Harold stood near the front entrance, greeting nearly everyone by name. He smiled. He laughed. He hugged people. To anyone arriving late, he looked like the perfect church elder. Then Grace pushed her cleaning cart toward the foyer to empty a trash bin. Harold noticed her immediately. "Grace," she stopped. Fingerprints on those entrance doors. She looked toward the glass panels. "Take care of them. It before second service." "Yes, sir." Daniel watched the exchange from across the lobby. Something wasn't right. Harold never spoke to anyone else that way, not the pastors, not the musicians, not the deacons, only Grace. It was as though every Sunday he searched for her, simply to remind her that nothing she did was ever enough. Late that afternoon, after the final service had ended and the last family had driven away, Grace remained behind. She always did. While everyone else returned home for Sunday dinners, she quietly cleaned what hundreds of visitors had left behind: paper cups, bulletins, candy wrappers, children's crayons, forgotten umbrellas. She never complained. Around 6 o'clock, Daniel found her polishing the wooden communion rail. "Been here since before 5 this morning." She nodded without looking up. "Almost finished." He hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" She smiled. "You already have." He laughed softly. "Why do you stay?" She continued polishing the wood until it reflected the evening sunlight pouring through the stained glass windows. "Because this place gave me hope once." Daniel waited. She didn't continue when Grace slowly placed the polished bottle back into her cart. "A very long time ago." "What happened?" For the first time that day, she became quiet. Her eyes drifted toward the large wooden cross hanging above the sanctuary stage. A memory had clearly found her. After several long seconds, she smiled again. "Maybe someday I'll tell you." Daniel realized he shouldn't push. Instead, he picked up a nearby trash bag. "Then at least let me help," Grace chuckled. "The associate pastor taking out garbage?" He grinned. "Jesus washed feet," she laughed. "Fair enough." For the next hour they worked side by side. Neither spoke very much. Yet Daniel noticed something unusual. Grace knew every corner of the building without thinking. She knew which pew had a loose screw, which classroom window stuck during humid weather, which hallway lights flickered after heavy rain. She even knew the exact year each section of the church had been renovated. It was as though she hadn't simply worked there. She had lived every chapter of the church's history. When they finally reached the fellowship hall, Daniel noticed an old framed photograph hanging on the wall. It showed the church nearly 40 years earlier. The building looked completely different. Only one small sanctuary stood where the enormous campus now stretched across several acres. Dozens of smiling volunteers stood outside holding shovels during what appeared to be the groundbreaking ceremony for the church's expansion. Generate an image. Daniel leaned closer. There you are. Grace turned. He pointed toward the photograph. A much younger Grace stood near the back row wearing simple clothes and holding a paper cup of lemonade. She smiled shyly at the camera. Daniel smiled. You haven't changed much, Grace laughed. Oh, I've changed more than you know. He continued studying the picture, then something caught his attention. Near the center stood a much younger Harold Bennett. His arm rested confidently around the founding pastor while everyone else smiled toward the camera, except Harold wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking directly toward Grace, not with anger, not with contempt, something else, something Daniel couldn't quite identify, regret, before Daniel could ask about it. Grace quietly lifted the photograph off the wall, dusted its frame with the edge of her cloth, and hung it back exactly where it had been. Some pictures tell stories, she whispered, and some stories are better understood when the time is right. How much longer can I keep this promise? The words disappeared into the silence of Harold Bennett's study. For several moments he remained seated behind the desk, his finger resting over Grace's younger face in the faded photograph. Outside the windows, the last trace of daylight vanished behind the Chattahoochee River, leaving the water dark and still beneath the evening sky. The housekeeper remained near the doorway. Mr. Bennett. Harold quickly turned the photograph face down. I said I'm not hungry. She hesitated. You barely touched breakfast this morning. That will be all, Martha. His voice carried the same authority it always did, but something beneath it had changed. Martha had worked in the Bennett household for 12 years. She had seen Harold command business executives, silence lawyers, and dismiss employees without raising his voice. She knew the difference between irritation and fear. Tonight, Harold Bennett was afraid. She quietly closed the door and left him alone. Harold leaned back in his chair and pressed both hands against his face. For 38 years he had convinced himself that silence was honorable. He had called it loyalty. He had called it protection. He had called it obedience to a promise made during the worst season of his life. But lately, silence no longer felt honorable. It felt like cowardice. He reached toward the telephone on his desk, lifted the receiver, and began dialing a number he knew by heart. He stopped after the 6th digit. His hand trembled. Then he slowly returned the receiver to its cradle. Across town, Grace Holloway stepped off a city bus carrying 2 grocery bags. The neighborhood where she lived stood far from Harold's riverside estate. There were no iron gates, private driveways, or carefully trimmed hedges. Grace's street was lined with small brick homes, old porches, and tall oak trees that had survived more storms than anyone could count. Several children played basketball beneath a streetlight. Good evening, Miss Grace. One of them called. Grace smiled. Evening, sweetheart. Don't let your mother catch you outside after dark. She said 10 more minutes. Grace raised an eyebrow. That means 5. Boy laughed and returned to the game. Grace walked 3 houses past her own and climbed the steps of a faded blue bungalow. She knocked twice before entering. Miss Evelyn. A weak voice answered from the living room. Here. Grace carried the groceries inside. Evelyn Carter was 74 and had recently undergone surgery on her hip. Her daughter lived in another state, and although neighbors checked on her occasionally, Grace came every evening. You didn't have to bring all this, Evelyn said. It's only soup, bread, and a few things for breakfast. Medicine. Grace removed a pharmacy bag and placed it on the table. Evelyn frowned. I told you I'd get that after my pension comes. I told you not to worry about it. I told you not to worry about it. Grace, you work too hard to keep spending money on everybody else. Grace moved toward the kitchen. Then stop being everybody else. Laughed softly. Grace poured soup into a pot, adjusted the heat, and inspected the collection of envelopes beside the refrigerator. She noticed one marked final notice and quietly turned it face down before Evelyn could see her looking. How was church? Evelyn asked. Grace paused. Busy. That old Harold Bennett trouble you again? Grace opened a cabinet. He was being Harold. Shook her head. I still don't understand why you let that man talk to you the way he does. Grace continued arranging the groceries. There are things more important than winning an argument. Sounds holy, but it doesn't make it right. Grace didn't answer. Evelyn studied her face. You've known him too long. Grace's hand stopped over a loaf of bread. What makes you say that? The way you look whenever someone mentions his name. Grace placed the bread down carefully. You should eat before your soup gets cold. Was a gentle dismissal, but Evelyn understood. Whatever connected Grace Holloway and Harold Bennett had begun long before either of them grew old, and Grace had no intention of discussing it. The following morning, Associate Pastor Daniel Brooks arrived at New Hope Community Church earlier than usual. The administrative wing remained quiet. Only the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional clicking of an old wall clock filled the hallway. Daniel carried a cup of coffee into the church library and switched on the lights. The library contained decades of church newsletters, anniversary programs, committee reports, and photographs. Most of the records had never been digitized. They sat inside tall wooden cabinets arranged by year, collecting dust behind glass doors. Daniel told himself he was only curious. That wasn't entirely true. The photograph in the fellowship hall had followed him home. He had spent most of the night thinking about Harold's expression. A younger Harold stood beside the founding pastor during the groundbreaking ceremony, but instead of looking proudly toward the camera, he had been staring at Grace. There was history in that glance. Daniel began with the church's 40th anniversary booklet. The first pages celebrated New Hope's founding in a rented storefront. The next section explained how the congregation purchased land and built the small original sanctuary. Photographs showed volunteers laying bricks, painting walls, and carrying lumber. Then came the expansion. According to the booklet, New Hope had nearly collapsed during a severe financial crisis 38 years earlier. Construction costs had risen unexpectedly. Donations had slowed. The bank threatened to seize the property. The next paragraph was strangely vague. Through the extraordinary generosity of faithful supporters, the financial obstacles were resolved, allowing construction to continue. Read the sentence again. No names, no amount, no explanation. The following page praised Harold Bennett for leading the expansion committee. There were photographs of Harold at fundraising dinners, Harold meeting with contractors, and Harold standing beside the newly completed sanctuary. Grace appeared nowhere. Daniel searched other anniversary booklets. The same wording appeared repeatedly. Faithful supporters, unexpected provision, a miraculous financial breakthrough. Each version avoided explaining where the money came from. Daniel pulled out a collection of newsletters from the year of the crisis. The early editions described the problem openly. One headline read, "New Hope faces possible foreclosure." Another announced an emergency meeting. A third asked every family to contribute whatever they could. Then the newsletters stopped. 3 months were missing. The next issue celebrated the continuation of construction but offered no details. Daniel checked the labels on the cabinet. January, February, March, then July, April, May, and June were gone. He crouched and searched the lower shelves. Nothing. Looking for something, Daniel turned quickly. An elderly man stood in the doorway holding a ring of keys. It was Deacon Samuel Price, the church's volunteer historian. Samuel was 83 and had attended New Hope since childhood. He knew the names of every pastor, every renovation, and nearly every family that had passed through the congregation. Daniel stood. "I was reading about the original expansion." Samuel's expression changed slightly. "That was a difficult time. I noticed several newsletters are missing. Old records disappear. 3 consecutive months." Samuel walked toward the cabinet and closed the glass door. "Paper doesn't last forever." Gestured toward the anniversary booklet. "It says faithful supporters solved the church's financial crisis." Who were they? Samuel took the booklet from Daniel's hands. "People gave what they could." Harold Bennett responsible? Samuel glanced at him. Elder Bennett chaired the expansion committee. "That wasn't my question." The old deacon remained silent. Daniel lowered his voice. "Was Grace involved?" Samuel's eyes immediately shifted toward the hallway. It was a small reaction, but Daniel saw it. "Why would you ask that?" Samuel said. "She was in the groundbreaking photograph." "Many people were." Harold was staring at her. Samuel placed the booklet back on the table. Young man, some parts of church history are better left in the past. Frowned. History doesn't disappear because we stop discussing it. No, but sometimes discussing it hurts people who have already suffered enough. Daniel could respond. Samuel walked out of the library. Daniel remained alone, more certain than before that the missing records were not an accident. Later that afternoon, Grace arrived at the church carrying a small toolbox. Daniel found her inside one of the children's classrooms tightening the screws on a loose cabinet door. "You're repairing furniture now," she smiled without turning. "This hinge has been complaining for 2 weeks." "I didn't know hinges complained." "You have to listen carefully." Leaned against the doorway. "And I ask you about the church expansion." The screwdriver stopped moving, only for a second, then Grace continued working. "What about it?" "I was reading some of the old records." "That sounds exciting." 3 months of newsletters are missing." Grace tightened another screw. "Old paper gets lost." "That's exactly what Deacon Price said. He's a wise man." Stepped farther into the room. "The records say the church was nearly foreclosed." "It was." "Was the debt settled?" Grace tested the cabinet door. "It closed." "I meant the church debt." "I know what you meant." She placed the screwdriver inside the toolbox. Daniel watched her carefully. "You were there. So were hundreds of other people." Harold led the expansion committee. "Yes, he saved the church." Grace finally looked at him. "What answer are you hopping to hear?" "The truth." "The truth is rarely one sentence, Pastor Daniel." "Then give me two." She almost smiled. Instead, she picked up the toolbox. "You should prepare for Wednesday's service." "Grace," she stopped near the doorway. "Why does Harold treat you like that?" The warmth disappeared from her face. "Not anger, something heavier." "Ask Harold." "Asking you." "I'm telling you that some answers don't belong to the person asking." Then she left. That evening, Harold's daughter arrived at his estate without calling. Vanessa Bennett Wells was 51, elegant and always perfectly composed. She served on 3 charitable boards, managed part of the Bennett Family Foundation, and had spent most of her adult life protecting the reputation attached to her surname. She found her father in the dining room staring at a plate he had not touched. "You missed the foundation meeting." Lifted his eyes. "I didn't feel well." "Never missed a meeting because you didn't feel well. There's a first time for everything." Vanessa sat across from him. "David says you've been distracted at the office. Your brother worries too much. He says you signed the same document twice." Jaw tightened. "What do you want, Vanessa?" She folded her hands. "I want you to step back." "What?" "The company, the foundation, the church board." Gave a dry laugh. "You arrived here to remove me from my own life. I came because people are beginning to notice." "What?" "That you're not yourself." Pushed his plate away. "I'm 78. I'm allowed to be tired." "This is more than tired." Vanessa looked toward the sideboard. The faded church photograph lay there. She picked it up. "I haven't seen this one before." Immediately stood. "That down." Vanessa looked surprised. "It's just a photograph." I said put it down. She studied the image. "That the cleaning woman from church." Harold stepped around the table and took the photograph from her. "Her name is Grace Holloway." Vanessa stared at him. "I know her name." "No, you don't." Something in his voice unsettled her. Harold held the photograph against his chest. Vanessa slowly rose from her chair. "What is going on?" "Nothing." "You nearly shouted at me over a picture of the janitor." "Don't call her that." Vanessa blinked. "You call her worse things every Sunday." The words landed between them. Harold turned away. Grace moved closer. "You enjoyed it." His eyes closed. "Yes." The confession came without resistance. For the first time, Harold Bennett sounded ashamed. "I enjoyed every plaque, every dinner, every speech. At first I told myself I was protecting your wishes. Then I began enjoying what people assumed. Before long I couldn't separate the promise from my pride." Grace's expression remained calm, but her fingers tightened around the cart handle. "That doesn't give you permission to reveal anything." "About the way I've treated you." "What about it?" "I became cruel." "You became frightened." Looked at her. "What?" "That one day someone would see you looking at me and ask the right question." The sanctuary fell silent. Harold's face slowly changed. Grace understood him better than anyone. Perhaps that was why he hated standing near her. She was living evidence that the version of himself he presented to the world was incomplete. "I need to correct this," he said. "You need to change." "I may not have enough time." Grace studied him. "What does that mean?" Harold reached inside his shirt pocket and removed a folded medical report. She did not take it. Doctor found something. Grace's composure faltered. How serious? Serious enough. Long? They don't know. Grace looked toward the empty pews. For decades she had imagined Harold being forced to confront the truth. In those private moments she believed she would feel vindicated. Instead, she felt tired. For decades she had imagined Harold being forced to confront the truth. In those private moments she believed she would feel vindicated. Instead, she felt tired. Harold placed the report beside him. "I've changed my will." Grace's eyes returned to him. "Involve me in your money." "It isn't about money." "Then what did you change?" Harold stood slowly and reached for his cane. "You'll find out when the time comes." "Harold." He walked past her toward the side exit. Grace turned. "What did you do?" Harold stopped beneath the stained glass window. For a moment the early sunlight surrounded him in shifting colors. "I made certain the promise would survive me." He continued walking. Grace remained motionless in the aisle. For the first time in 38 years, she was no longer certain that keeping the secret had been the right decision. At 9 o'clock, Daniel entered the fellowship hall and found Deacon Samuel Price waiting near the old photograph. The elderly historian held a thin leather ledger beneath one arm. "I shouldn't be doing this," Samuel said. Daniel closed the door behind him. "Doing what?" Samuel placed the ledger on a table. "This belonged to the church treasurer during the expansion." Opened it carefully. The pages listed construction expenses, donations, bank payments, and outstanding balances. Near the middle, one page had been removed, not torn carelessly, cut neatly along the binding. Daniel looked up. "Who removed it?" Samuel shook his head. "I don't know." "What was on it?" "I never saw the page." "Then why bring this to me?" Samuel pointed toward the page immediately after the missing one. At the top, written in faded ink, were 4 words, "Debt satisfied in full." Below them was a date, 38 years earlier. Daniel studied the entries surrounding it. There was no donor's name, no bank reference, no explanation of where the money had come from, only a handwritten notation in the margin, "BY request," no public acknowledgement. Daniel felt a chill move through him. Who made the request? Samuel lowered himself into a nearby chair. The founding pastor knew. "He's dead." "Yes." "Treasurer, dead." "Harold." Samuel said nothing. "Grace." Still nothing. Daniel closed the ledger. "You know more than you're telling me." Samuel's eyes filled with regret. "I know that New Hope would not be standing today without what happened during those missing months." "Then why hide it?" "Because someone asked us to." "Who?" Samuel looked toward the photograph. His gaze settled not on Harold but on the shy young woman standing near the back row with a cup of lemonade in her hand. Before he could speak, the fellowship hall door opened. Grace stood in the entrance. Her eyes moved from Samuel to Daniel and then to the ledger. The warmth left her face. "Where did you get that?" Samuel lowered his head. Daniel rose slowly. "Miss Grace, I think it's time you told me what happened." Grace walked toward the table and placed one hand on the ledger, stared at her. "Someone saved this church." Grace closed the book. "Then be grateful." "It Harold." Grace looked across the room toward the groundbreaking photograph. Answer came so quietly that Daniel almost missed it. Before he could ask another question, the sanctuary bell rang unexpectedly, once, then again, then a third time. Grace looked toward the hallway. No one used the old bell before Sunday service. A church administrator came running through the doorway, breathless and pale. "Pastor Daniel, you need to come quickly." "Happened?" "It's Elder Bennett." Grace's hand slipped from the ledger. The administrator struggled to catch his breath. He collapsed outside the sanctuary. Rushed toward the door. Samuel followed. Grace remained beside the table for one frozen second, staring at the handwritten words inside the open ledger. "Debt satisfied in full." Then she whispered a name she had not spoken with tenderness in many years. Ran after them. The church hallway erupted into chaos. Members abandoned conversations. Choir robes swayed as singers rushed toward the sanctuary entrance. Someone shouted for an ambulance. Another called for the church nurse. Associate Pastor Daniel Brooks pushed through the growing crowd until he reached the marble foyer. Harold Bennett lay motionless on the polished floor. His silver cane rested several feet away. The same marble floor where, only hours earlier, he had criticized Grace for missing a spot. Now no one noticed the floor at all. A church nurse knelt beside him, checking for a pulse. "He's breathing," she called. "But it's weak." Daniel dropped to one knee. "Elder Bennett, can you hear me?" Harold's eyelids fluttered. For a brief moment they opened. His gaze searched the crowd, not for his daughter, not for the deacons, not for the pastors. His eyes stopped on Grace. She stood frozen near the sanctuary doors, her hands trembling at her sides, for the first time in 38 years. Harold looked at her without pride, without anger, without pretending, only regret. Then his eyes closed again. The distant wail of sirens grew louder. Within minutes, paramedics hurried inside carrying medical equipment. Everyone stepped back. Church members formed a circle around the scene. Whispers spread through the sanctuary. "What happened? Was it a heart attack? I saw him speaking with Miss Grace earlier." Grace lowered her eyes. She had expected questions. She hadn't expected pity. Daniel stepped beside her. "You don't have to stand here." Voice barely rose above a whisper. "Stood here before." The words carried decades of exhaustion. The paramedics carefully lifted Harold onto a stretcher. As they rolled him toward the ambulance, his right hand slipped from beneath the blanket. His fingers moved barely. Daniel leaned closer. "Harold," the old man's lips trembled. "James." Daniel frowned. "James Carter." Harold gave the slightest nod. His breathing became shallow. "Bring James." The ambulance doors closed. Moments later, the vehicle disappeared down the road with its lights flashing into the afternoon sky. Silence settled over New Hope Community Church. The Sunday service had ended, yet no one went home. Groups gathered throughout the lobby discussing what they had witnessed. Some prayed quietly, others speculated. Near the fellowship hall, Vanessa Bennett Wells arrived almost running. Her brother David followed close behind. "What happened?" Vanessa demanded. Daniel met them near the entrance. "Paramedics believe it was a cardiac event. He alive. They stabilized him before leaving." Vanessa closed her eyes briefly. Then she noticed Grace standing alone near the back hallway. Something about Grace's expression caught her attention. Not fear, not surprise, sorrow. Vanessa walked toward her. "Were you with my father?" Grace nodded. "For a little while." "What did he say?" Grace remained silent. "I asked you a question," Grace finally answered. "He spoke about things that should have been spoken about many years ago." Vanessa frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means." Grace looked toward the stained glass windows. "Time has a way of collecting unpaid debts." Before Vanessa could ask another question, Grace quietly picked up her cleaning cart and disappeared down the hallway. Across town, Harold Bennett was rushed into the emergency department. Doctors moved quickly. Machines beeped. Nurses called out blood pressure readings. Outside the intensive care unit, James Carter arrived less than 20 minutes after Daniel's phone call. James had served as Harold's attorney for nearly 25 years. He was one of the few people Harold trusted completely. Daniel met him outside the waiting room. "He asked for you." James looked surprised. "My office received a voicemail from him this morning." "You didn't speak?" "No." James reached into his briefcase. "He only said." The attorney stopped. "What?" "He told me to bring the sealed envelope." Daniel remembered Harold's words. "Bring James." This wasn't an accident. Harold had expected something. Nearly 2 hours passed before a physician entered the waiting room. "Family of Mr. Harold Bennett." Vanessa and David stood immediately. "He's stable." Both sighed with relief. The doctor hesitated. He regained consciousness briefly. "We see him for only a few minutes." Harold looked smaller beneath the hospital blankets. The confidence that once filled every room had disappeared. Only fatigue remained. His eyes slowly opened. "Vanessa." "I'm here, Dad." "David." "I'm here too." Harold looked past them. "James." Attorney stepped closer. "You asked for me." Harold nodded weakly. "Envelope." James removed a large cream-colored envelope from his briefcase. Across the front, written in Harold's own handwriting, were the words, "Open only if I do not return." Vanessa stared. "What is that?" Harold ignored the question. Instead, he looked toward Daniel. "Pastor." Daniel moved beside the bed. "I'm here." Harold struggled to breathe. His voice was barely audible when Daniel leaned closer. "The time comes." Another long breath. "Don't let." Daniel could barely hear him. "Grace." His breathing grew weaker. "Leave." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Harold tried to continue. His lips moved, but no sound came out. The heart monitor suddenly beeped faster. Doctors rushed inside. "Everyone out." The family was ushered into the hallway, the doors closed behind them. Vanessa rounded on James. Envelope. James held it firmly against his chest. I can't discuss it. You work for our family. I work for your father. David stepped forward. Does this have something to do with church? James remained calm. I cannot answer that. Vanessa folded her arms, and Grace, still silence. The attorney's silence answered more than words ever could for the first time. Vanessa began wondering if the quiet woman who cleaned the church every Sunday had been connected to her father, in ways their family had never imagined. Late that evening, Daniel returned to New Hope Community Church. The building was empty. The sanctuary lights had been dimmed. Only a few candles near the altar remained lit. He walked slowly toward the front pew where Harold had been sitting that morning. Everything felt different. The church no longer seemed like a building. It felt like a puzzle. He remembered every clue, the missing newsletters, the removed ledger page, the old photograph, Grace's silence, Harold's regret, and now, don't let Grace leave. Leave where? Leave the hospital, leave the church, leave before the truth was revealed. None of it made sense. As Daniel stood in the quiet sanctuary, he heard soft footsteps behind him. He turned. Grace. She had changed back into her simple navy cardigan and was carrying her handbag instead of her cleaning supplies. I thought you'd gone home, Daniel said. I almost did. She walked slowly toward the front pews. I came to pray. Daniel hesitated. Harold asked me not to let you leave. Grace stopped walking. For several seconds she said nothing, then she smiled sadly. So, finally said it. Daniel looked confused. You knew he would. Grace's eyes drifted toward the cross hanging above the stage. I hoped he never would. Daniel searched her face. Miss Grace. She looked back at him. If Harold doesn't survive. Daniel waited. Everything changes. Before he could ask what she meant, Grace quietly walked into the sanctuary, knelt alone at the front altar and bowed her head in prayer. Daniel remained standing in the aisle, watching, wondering, because for the first time since arriving at New Hope Community Church, he wasn't sure whether he was witnessing the end of a secret or the beginning of one. The paramedics carefully lifted Harold Bennett onto the stretcher. Around him, New Hope Community Church had fallen completely silent. The powerful elder who had spent years criticizing Grace Holloway now looked frighteningly helpless. As the paramedics began wheeling him toward the doors, Harold's eyes suddenly opened. His hand moved weakly from beneath the blanket. Wait, Daniel said. Harold's lips moved. Daniel leaned closer. What is it? Harold struggled to speak. James frowned. Carter. Your attorney. Harold gave the smallest nod. Then his eyes moved past Daniel, across the frightened congregation, past Vanessa, past David, until they found Grace. How she stood alone near the sanctuary doors. Harold stared at her, and for the first time Daniel had ever witnessed. There was no contempt in his eyes, no arrogance, no anger. There was fear and regret. Harold whispered something so quietly that Daniel almost missed it. 38 years. Grace's face changed instantly. Daniel turned toward her. What happened 38 years ago? Grace said nothing. The ambulance doors slammed shut. Sirens screamed to life. And as Harold Bennett disappeared toward the hospital, Daniel looked back at the woman everyone knew only as the church janitor. Then he remembered the missing newsletters, the old photograph, the removed ledger page, and the unexplained payment that had saved New Hope from foreclosure 38 years earlier. For the first time, Daniel understood. Grace wasn't hiding something from Harold. She was hiding something for him. But why, and what could possibly be so important that she had allowed the man who humiliated her every Sunday to keep the secret for 38 years? Grace slowly turned toward Daniel. If Harold survives, she whispered, you may finally get the answer you've been looking for. Swallowed. If he doesn't, Grace looked toward the disappearing ambulance, her eyes filled with tears. Then his will is going to tell you. The secret has survived 38 years, but not for much longer. Part 2. The WILL is OPENED.